Good evening. Hello, and welcome to the fourth and last iconic lecture of your journey. And today we'll be looking at the history of Spain. Last time we looked at the history of France, and you'll find it's pretty interesting to see how similarly they both kind of started up as far as geography and waves of migration. So again, it's going to be a very broad sweep. So if I miss any of your favorite moments or major figures, please come up and we'll talk about them. So today's lecture, we're going to be looking at a few different categories and in the timeline that we have. And first we'll be looking at an introduction to the early history, which begins back with Paleolithic times and cave paintings. Then it follows with waves of migration and the establishment of trade patterns with the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and the Romans. Then we have 800 years of Islam that occupies the Iberian Peninsula and creates this kind of wonderful flowering of culture and the arts. And then after that, we go into the Golden Imperial Age, so the age of exploration, and the age of exploitation, if you want to look at what it was looking like in the New World for Spanish at the time. And then finally, modern history. And we'll be looking at the Spanish-American War, we'll be looking at the Spanish Civil War, and of course, kind of ending up with the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. So first, let's talk about topography. Spain is in a really unique position with its geography in that it's kind of isolated. You have, for certainly around the borders, you have quite an extensive coastline, which has allowed it to become kind of populated and trade posts have been established along that. And then to the north, you have the Pyrenees. And the Pyrenees kind of perform this, it makes a natural barrier. And not just for geography, but also culturally, it becomes a border as well. An interesting tidbit is that Madrid is actually closer to Tangier in Morocco than it is to Paris. So if you think about that for a minute and look at this map without kind of the divisions that we've put on it between continents, you can really see how close it is to northern Africa. Now, only 25% of the land is arable, and there's low rainfall as well, so that sometimes plays into account with certain harvest and food shortages throughout time. And finally, it's the furthest west that you can, well, almost the furthest west you can get with Europe, and so it's ideally suited for becoming the stop-off point for the age of exploration, for the boats leaving to the New World. Now, Spanish identity is something that is a little tricky, and if you were here for the Port Talk, Viking has a number of wonderful videos they've created on Spanish culture and history, so I would encourage you to go look at those online. I think they're connected to your My Viking journey. If not, you can Google them. It'll connect through YouTube. But it's been said they're a collection of glued regions, and then in the same vein, or maybe not so glued. So nowhere is there more of a connection to someone's region than it would be for someone living in Spain. So we've heard about Catalonia, we've heard in our watching the news, you hear about separatist movements in the Basque Country as well. And this shows this kind of uneasy, at times, conglomeration of regions that are being ruled by Madrid. So here's a quick timeline of Spanish history. And of course, it kind of follows what I just mentioned before, starting way back when, in 33 BC, with Altamira, the Romans, the Visigoths, the arrival of Islam, and so on and so forth, until we come down into the modern age and EU membership. Now, also, if you came to the talk on the history of France, you'll know that France and Spain are known for a lot of their Paleolithic cave paintings. The dates vary wildly, but some of the earliest examples that have been found, and also in our modern age, some of the earliest to us, have been found in Spain. The image on your right, the bison at Altamira, that has been dated very differently. So either between 13,000 and 15,000 BC, or all the way back to 33,000 BC. Testing is getting better, but these cave paintings are so old that it really, there's a lot of controversy in trying to find the correct date. You can also see on the map where the northern sections of Spain where it was found. Southern France, northern Spain. This is also another interesting item that we have. This is also from a cave, and it's a negative handprint. So we call it negative when you blow the paint out and then remove the hand. And they believe this is dated to as early as 39,000 BCE. So quite a wonderful set of cave paintings found in Spain. So next we have different groups coming in, setting up trading posts, looking for resources. The first group that we have come through are the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians were specifically looking for metal, but they established trading posts. You can kind of see on this map how far over they're coming from the Middle East, looking for resources. And they were there around 1000 BC. Then the next group that comes in are the Greeks. There are a few Greek settlements. I believe there's a Greek settlement found not too far from Barcelona. Herodotus mentions that the Greeks were in southern Spain as well. So he's not always the best one to follow for certain things, but that's probably fairly trustworthy. And then finally, the Carthaginians. They were based in Tunisia. They had a presence as well along the coast just from sheer location, just proximity. But when the Romans defeated the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War, then they lost any hold anywhere. But then, of course, in come the Romans, and 700 years of Roman rule. And they bring in the infrastructure, they bring in the different styles of building that you see here. Two emperors, very famous emperors, were from this area. They are Trajan and Hadrian. They were from the Iberian Peninsula. So they were considered good emperors throughout later history of the empire. Now, when Rome started to weaken in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, there were Germanic tribes that were moving across Europe back and forth. But eventually the Visigoths were the ones that really settled most of the Iberian Peninsula. You can see here on the map how they kind of split up with the Ostrogoths in Italy and so forth. The Visigoths, they didn't leave behind much of anything other than jewelry. We don't really have any major buildings from them, even though they were there for almost 300 years. They established their capital in Toledo in the 500s, and the way we really learn much about them is through the kind of small pieces that we have, jewelry, metallurgy, more of the smaller finds. So now we have the Iberian Peninsula. It's been under rule for the last 1,000 years only by two groups. But then we have a momentous year, 711. Easy to remember for the Americans, 711. The Arab and Berber troops that were moving across northern Africa, they crossed at the Straits of Gibraltar and moved into Spain. Now, from this map, you can see the expansion of Islam, starting off, of course, in Saudi Arabia and moving very quickly. Look at these dates, 622, 632, 661. And the Umayyad Caliphate was responsible for the expansion in Spain. So you can see 661 to 750. But 711 is kind of the date that that historians use to kind of pinpoint that moment of conquest. Now, they took on the Visigoths and took over Toledo, and that went very well, so they just kept pushing. And if you were here also for the History of France talk, you'll know that they kept pushing past Spain and the Iberian Peninsula up into France. But then we had Charles Martel stop them at the Battle of Tours and push them back. So France didn't really happen. There might be a little smidge that you see there, but the progression had stopped as they were moving north. So the Iberian Peninsula is kind of where they stayed in Western Europe. So we talk about this, it's 800 years of Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, and they talk about the conquest and the reconquest in 1492, another date easy to remember for various reasons. But it was a flowering of culture that had not really been seen in that area to this extent. When they came, when the Muslims came, they brought they have many scholars, and they set up many schools for learning. You have these wonderful manuscripts here showing scholars in a library, a doctor and a patient. They were really pushing the knowledge envelope. And at the time, this area, particularly the site of Cordoba, that became what it says, an intellectual powerhouse. It was on the same footing as Cairo and Baghdad at the time for being a repository of knowledge. And so this was something that hadn't really been seen in this area before. Now, you hear about this unification and the fact that the peninsula is being ruled almost exclusively by the Umayyad Caliphate. But there were still political and religious wars being fought. So the Christians were still trying to take back certain cities, and they did. So it wasn't something that was completely smooth and linear. It was a little bit more organic as they kind of moved into different places and would try to take them back and try to regain control. Now, at the towards the end of this period, you have the Nasrids. And the Nasrids were the last Muslim dynasty to really kind of have any kind of control during this time. And they founded the Kingdom of Granada in 1230. Now, because of this waning control that the Muslims were having, they decided to make kind of a deal with Ferdinand III and said, okay, well, we'll provide you protection and we'll pay some taxes and stuff if you allow us to stay a kingdom and allow us to remain Muslim. So that worked for a while. But then it didn't. But what you have here on this slide, and of course it's a beautiful example, this is the site of Alhambra, and it was a palace complex that was located in Granada. And you see this beautiful, what do you call muqarnas? This almost like stalactite type of decoration that's popular in Islamic buildings. Quite beautiful, and the way the Alhambra is set up, it's kind of a large quadrangle with rooms that go off of it, and then each successive ruler would build onto it, and then kind of connect them with these small little alleyways and whatnot. But it's certainly one of the greatest achievements of Islamic art and architecture. So if you go to a store and you're looking for a book on that, sometimes this is the poster. This is the poster child building. It's just quite beautiful. Now, in 1453, Constantinople falls. And you think, well, okay, we've flown all the way to the other side of the Mediterranean. What's that got to do with us? Well, actually a lot. The Muslims were losing control in the Iberian Peninsula, and the Christians were fighting them. Then you have the Crusades still going on in the East, in the Holy Land. However, in 1453, Constantinople falls to Mehmed II, who is an Ottoman. So it falls to the Ottomans. And what it does is it basically shuts off the Silk Road. So all that trade and commerce that was coming through there all the way back to Europe, that ended. So what this does is a number of things. One, it pushes the intellectuals and scholars out of the city, and they start kind of pouring into Europe, mainland Europe. Two, the nations are looking for an alternative to getting these resources. So, and trying to find another overland route to the east. But then, now they have an incentive to get in a boat and go across the Atlantic. They're really looking for those resources that they just don't have anymore. So in 1469, amidst all of this, we have the unification of the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. You have Ferdinand and Isabella, they marry, and they become kind of a powerhouse themselves. And this is often thought of as laying the foundation for that golden age. They became pioneers for exploration, and then they set the stage too for the final conquering of the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. So here's 1492, like we mentioned before, and a lot of things happen. You might be most familiar with the last thing, but January 2nd, Granada falls. And they finally expelled the last Muslim dynasty of the Nasrids. They expel them out of Spain. Then you have the first European grammar. It's actually a Spanish language grammar. And this, of course, helps set the stage too for the Golden Age and a cultural renaissance that goes with it. Then, of course, you have Christopher Columbus and his discovery of the New World on behalf of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, the Golden Imperial Age, we talk about Golden Ages often. This was literally a golden age because we have explorers going to the New World, and the conquistadors are encountering major cultures that they didn't even know existed, and things kind of go, as my mother would say, to hell in a handbasket, right? So Columbus, he makes it to the Caribbean, but he doesn't encounter a very structured, massive empire like the Aztecs. However, Hernan Cortez does. And he goes and makes it all the way to the Aztec metropolis of Tenochtitlan. And it's a vast empire that just really absolutely blew his mind. Everything was covered in gold. They had the wide streets and the beautiful temples and pyramids. He was greeted by Moctezuma, the ruler. And, he was greeted in a very nice way. Cortez turned around and put him under arrest, basically. And took him hostage. So this city, though, was bigger than Paris or London was at the time, and it was full of all of these elements that make a great city. Now, Cortez, though, said in a letter back home, "Can there be anything more magnificent than that this barbarian lord should have all the things to be found under the heavens in his domain, fashioned in gold and silver and jewels and feathers?" So he was a teeny little bit jealous, I think, when he got there and saw the amount of wealth that was there. So, and you can see that here. The conquistadors are absolutely amazed. And you can see some beautiful examples of some of the pieces there on the right, Moctezuma's headdress, the Mishtek gold. It was everywhere. So 4 things happen quite quickly, one after the other, after Cortez gets there. Well, Cortez actually leaves. He's kind of coming back and forth, but he leaves his deputy in charge, and his deputy attacked and killed hundreds of Aztecs during a ceremony in 1520. After that, Moctezuma was killed by his own people for welcoming the Spanish. Then the Aztecs kicked the Spanish out, but then Cortez is like, oh, so he goes back and he lays waste to the city. And so finally, the Aztecs, they've been defeated, but then Cortez brought them also the wonderful gift of smallpox. And it decimated the empire within 2 years. That's it, just 2 years. All of it was in ruins. So, rivers of gold. Yes, and that's what he thought. Cortez himself said, quote, that I suffer from a disease of the heart that is only cured by gold, end quote. So, what's happening to all the gold? What happened to all the gold? It was melted down and shipped back to Spain. We lost countless and countless numbers of artifacts that we know of. And I just want to go back and show this too. The Moche gold mask is just stunning. It's stunning. But they didn't need that. They just wanted the pure value of the gold. The king, he had funded so many wars, and he had huge debts at home. And he wanted the money to keep that kind of lifestyle up. Let me see real quick. Yeah, so estimates are there were about 180 tons of gold that were shipped back to Spain, 15,000 tons of silver. And the Spanish were still, even with all of this, were still living above their means. Still. The Spanish Armada had cost 10 million ducats, more than 3 times any budget that they had. And they were spending all this new world money, and they wanted more. So you know that this is not going to go well. Those coffers are going to dry up very quickly. Also, the peasants were paying taxes, and the nobility in the church were not. So if this isn't a recipe for disaster that we've seen time and time again, then I don't know what is. So even going downhill, we have this quote that God is Spanish, this very kind of cocky expression from a government in decline. And Spain was involved in a number of conflicts in various places. At this time, they lost Portugal and France. They lost Portugal, and France became the greatest kind of dominant power in Europe. The Spanish in their overseas holdings were also challenged as well. So now modern history, Spain's modern history begins in the 19th century. When we think of modern, we think closer to us, but modern history often starts 19th century. France invaded Spain, overthrowing Ferdinand VII. So they took this opportunity of weakness and went in. And Napoleon put his brother, who was Joseph, but named him King Jose I, put him on the throne in 1808. And there was a lot of resistance to this, of course. And there's a lot of visual information on this slide as well. So you have the major players here. In that, so you have Joseph Bonaparte, who was ruling as king, and they got rid of Napoleon, and they got rid of him, but then Ferdinand VII came back. And they didn't like him anymore either. I mean, because he'd been kicked out, and he comes back. So he was really unpopular. Then his daughter, Isabel II, she rules for 30 years, but then they don't like her, and they kick her out. This is kind of going back and forth. A republic was actually established at one point, but it only lasted 2 years. And then the monarchy came back again with Isabel's son, Alfonso XII. And then he had his son, Alfonso XIII. You see Goya's work in the background here. It's showing the uprising of the Spanish against the French. So, in a separate vein, we have the Spanish-American War. Now, the Spanish had been in Cuba and had been ruling Cuba since the 16th century. And they had occupied it, but they were very harsh to the Cubans, the Spanish were, and the Americans started hearing about this. And they became, deeply sympathetic to their plight. So the president at the time, McKinley, did not want to start another war, but he said, all right, I'll send the USS Maine down to Cuba just to kind of as a show of support. But then there was an explosion right after they got there, and the vessel was damaged. There were 260 men on board who were killed. So we were in it then, whatever it was. We're not exactly sure. I think they're not exactly sure how the explosion happened, but we were certainly committed as Americans to see this thing through. And the Secretary of State, John Hay, at the time called it a splendid little war, because he knew that the Americans would be able to show their strength, and Spain was certainly on the decline. So this is really kind of part of the end of their empire at that time, and it was very brutal, but it was quite short and didn't last. It didn't last very long. Now, Alfonso XIII, as I mentioned before, he was becoming increasingly unpopular. He was very disconnected with the people. When one of his generals reported back on the defeat of the Spanish in a battle in Morocco, he was out playing golf. And he said, well, to the news, he just said, well, chicken meat is cheap. Is this like a let them eat cake thing? I don't know if that was actually what was said, but he resumed his golfing. So that didn't really, he wasn't really going to be there much longer. So the Republicans won a victory in municipal elections. So Alfonso just said, oh, okay. So he fled and he went to Rome. And so later in the year, in 1931, a new Spanish constitution was implemented, and it implemented this second republic here. And the reforms were quite progressive. So it was a good thing. The women got the right to vote. There was legalized divorce, freedom of speech, etc. And they threw in autonomy for regions if they were interested in it, like Catalonia and the Basque Country. And that didn't last long. So I just want to mention, too, with this Civil War, of course, Alan was speaking about it in his Papa Hemingway talk yesterday. Viking also has a number of wonderful videos particularly on Spain. You saw a few of them earlier, but they also have one on the Spanish Civil War. I'm not exactly sure where to get it through the Viking website, but I think you can Google it and it'll pop up in YouTube. So I'm doing the Cliff Notes version here. So then we see at this time we see the emergence of someone that will become quite an influence on Spain. This is that of General Francisco Franco. Franco attempted a coup in 1936, and while he didn't succeed, it set the stage for the Civil War. And the Civil War, really, you had Republicans on one hand. They were left-leaning. They were in alliance with communists, unions, anarchists, peasants. They were supported by the Soviet Union and also the international brigades, Hemingway being one of them. There were a number of people from other countries that were joining in. The nationalists, though, were supported by fascist Germany and Italy. And the war was really the outcome of the polarization of Spanish life and politics that had been slowly developing during these years. And the Civil War, it would go through kind of long periods of stalemate and then rapid breakthroughs by the nationalists. And of course, Franco played a huge role during this time. He was born into a military family, and he rose through the ranks and became a general at the very young age of 33. And he had led the uprisings in 1936 against the Republicans, and he was declared head of the nationalists with the support of Germany and Italy. So after 3 years of really bloody fighting, the Republicans surrendered, and Franco began his dictatorship that lasted until his death in 1975. So this is an art piece. I don't know if any of you have seen it. This is a work by Pablo Picasso called Guernica. And what it does is it shows basically a moment in time when Franco had ordered the German and Italians to bomb this town of Guernica, which really had no military importance. They wanted to just bomb it indiscriminately. And this shocked the world. And it shocked Picasso, too. Picasso wasn't a particularly political painter. One of the expositions, I think it was one that was going to be in Paris, they had one... they had asked him to submit a work for the Spanish pavilion in Paris, and this is what he submitted. And it's huge. You don't see the scale of it. Has anyone seen it in person? Yes. Good. I think it's in Madrid now, yes? Yeah. It's my understanding it's huge. It's like 11 feet by 25 feet or something. It almost envelops you when you see it, or so I've been told. Unfortunately, I have not been able to see this work in person. But it really speaks to the horrors of war. And it's one of the best anti-war paintings in the world. And, you first look at it as kind of a jumbled mess. But if you stand and look for a while, you can spot, the grieving mother with the dead child in her arms, bodies kind of littering the streets, people running out of buildings on fire, screaming. Sometimes there's made mention of the horse and the bull symbolism here, and if it reflected the nationalists and the Republicans, but Picasso never really gave forth that information. It's in black and white, and it's thought that it reflects what the newspaper stories look like and what the film footage look like, and you can see part of the shell of Guernica. I think they believed it was about 1,500 people were killed in this bombing. So in 1975, on the left, you have a group of people standing around reading that Franco has died. And Franco had chosen Juan Carlos to be his successor because he thought he would uphold his specific kind of political structure. And that didn't really happen. He moved away from that. So that was something that kind of backfired for Franco. Now, EU and EU membership, I think Spain and Portugal became members of the EU in 1986. They adopted the euro in 2002. And being part of the EU was part of this strategy to really kind of modernize Spain and kind of bring them up to speed. They, being under such a harsh dictatorship for so long, they had to kind of play catch up. And they wanted to really anchor democracy into their government, and so that was part of joining this. So now it really truly is on par with many of the other Western European countries. Now, if you were here for the Port Talk, you saw how there is an issue for independence, particularly for Catalonia, and you see more and more protest each year on September 11th. Now, for Americans, September 11th is certainly a day for us, remembering something else, but they are still pushing for that independence that they had. Franco had suppressed them for so long, they weren't even, like it was mentioned in the videos too earlier, you weren't allowed to even speak the language. Everything was basically cut off. But this movement, some years it really does kind of the news makes it all the way to us, even in the U.S., over everything else that's going on, because they are in direct conflict with Madrid, and it really shows no signs of abating. They're fiercely proud of their heritage and really want to have that independence. Spain today, they are certainly coming forward, but they're also still holding up their traditions. Spain is certainly rooted in its ancient traditions, but it definitely has become a significant player on the world stage. So in summation, we have so much that really happens to Spain throughout history. First, with numerous groups of traders and settlers coming in, and then the Romans establishing a solid infrastructure. Then the progression of Islam across the Iberian Peninsula, and then the Golden Age, where it's this really golden age of exploration. There's conflict and turmoil, of course, and certainly that can be seen particularly with Franco's reign. And then in the end, after they come out from under the thumb of Franco, they've really emerged as kind of an active player on the world stage. All right, thank you for coming.